welcome to this very interesting talk. We are fortunate to have two immensely resourceful people here and complemented by our director. So I'll invite our director, Aro, to the stage. And some ways, the three people will be there speaking on issues from a particular perspective, but they are connected and also complementary. So we are all concerned about sustainability, and this has become a big question across academia, industry, markets, uh, because our survival is at stake. And some of the changes that we are witnessing across the environmental landscape, economic landscape, all actually forcing us to think very critically and carefully about sustainability. And one of the ways to look at sustainability is to look at history, like what choices we have made over the last 50 years, which has resulted in a situation where we are in, which is very unsustainable. And the second way is to critically look at the pathways that are available for us to kind of think about making the right kind of choices. So we have Professor Maarten Hajer, who heads the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University, who's thinking about these questions for many, many years. One of the interesting things about Maarten is that is temporally very agile. See, he critically looks into the past, but he is able to look into the future as well. So that's the task of the Urban Future Studio. He's world's leading political scientist. So he'll join us here and talk about the drama of environmental politics. And as you see, looking back and ahead, so it's past and future both. And then we have Professor Mark Swilling, who co-leads the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, near Cape Town. He is the world's leading sustainability thinkers, amongst the world's leading sustainability thinkers, and one of his important roles has been to bring environment, development, and economic growth together. And he has been influential and instrumental in shaping or thinking about some careful choices that the African continent has made. So he'll be reflecting on this latest work that he did on Africa, where they're looking at how can environment and development be brought together. And the session will be moderated by our director, Aromar Revi, and we all know about him. He has been in this space and shaping discourse for almost 40 years now. So I'll hand this stage and mic to Aro for the session. And enjoy yourself, ask questions, but first listen to them.
So, evening, I guess, for most people in this part of the world, early morning in other parts of the world. I guess we're going live on this. I'm really glad to have both Maarten and Mark here. We've had a wonderful, almost 2 weeks together here as part of an ongoing dialogue, which has been running for a number of years, looking specifically at the energy transition. But I think today we're going to be going wider and looking at sustainability itself in a much wider context. And, to be fairly frank about it, transitions are important, and we really have to accelerate multiple transitions simultaneously. But actually what we need is transformation. And I think both Mark and Maarten have thought about and acted on these questions in their own contexts, in Africa and of course across the world, in Europe and also across the world. So transitions are important. They are the sort of a minimum building block that we require, especially as we are, both in the Anthropocene and currently, I'm not sure whether it's Kondratiev or not, but certainly in the middle of a deep polycrisis. So I think what we'll try and explore today from at least two different or multiple different geographies is how this actually plays itself out, and what are the minimum conditions that we need to be able to deal with. Because if you look at the world today, as a species and a set of cultures, we've been extremely successful. Right? You wouldn't have 8 billion people on the planet if we were not extremely successful. We're also, more wealthy and produce more output and consume more things than ever before in history. But let's say if that's the positive side, we are potentially headed for multiple overshoots and collapses over the next few decades, if not more. And I guess one of the questions is, how can we take the potential of so many billion people across the world and use that to build a set of futures? And they're going to be multiple futures because the starting points are quite different across the world in different cultures and different ecological contexts that actually make sense, because we have more human potential in this century than pretty much everything we know, certainly the Holocene, which is 10,000 years, and even before that. So I think this is the sort of interesting challenge that we face. Climate is one aspect of it, biodiversity is another, but we are a species that are very prone to creating crises that set us up in very difficult things, whether it's war at one end or inequality. So yeah, I'm going to open up ask Maarten to take the floor first, and then we'll pick up with Mark, and then we'll open up the discussion, because today's been a very creative day, and we hope to close with a high note of high creativity. So Maarten, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Aro and Amir, for kicking this off. What I will say is a sort of a short summary of a text I'm writing, finishing actually now, fortunately, finally, with Jeroen Alme, which is supposed to be sequenced to a 95 book, which is on the politics of environmental discourse. And this is provisionally entitled The Drama of Environmental Discourse. And it starts off with this familiar face. I mean, whatever you think, this is an absolute hero of our age. I mean, in that position of defending parliamentary democracy, he is doing his utmost best to get us in the right direction. I'm not talking about Gaza, what he does there. I mean, he's a courageous social democratic leader, but he's also the person that said this a couple of years ago. So the 2020s in the official UN speak are the decade of action, and we will overcome poverty and inequality. We're going to live in harmony with nature, and we're going to leave no one behind. So the question, of course, how do you interpret such a statement? Is a policy program that with a pathway to 2030 when it's all done, or is it a statement of intent? And I hope we all agree that it is a statement of intent and of our value commitments, because otherwise it would, of course, be quite dramatic, the way in which we have to look at the realization of that program halfway through that decade. Now, what I will do with you, and I speak a little fast, if you think that I should slow down, please tell me, but I'm assuming that a lot of what I say is something you know. So if you think initially, and then afterwards I'll do the second bit. But before I go through the history, let me say I'm speaking on two levels. So I'm first of all saying, let's take language very seriously. And we discussed that earlier in the summer school today. So language does not simply mirror or picture the world, but it profoundly shape that world. And it's also true for nature. So for instance, the choice to speak about it in terms of the natural science is a choice in itself. To invoke, as Johan Rockström easily does, humanity as having a problem, of course makes it more difficult to differentiate which humans are perhaps not talking about a future catastrophe, but actually experience a catastrophe, etc. So words matter in the environmental political game. But what I've added to it in later work is that whole idea that there is also a dramaturgy, that you can actually analyze politics also for who says what, how things are said, where things are being said, and to whom things are being said. And all these four categories have an explanatory value about the power of these discursive statements. And I call that together a script. So you can, like in the case of Guterres, you could analyze what he said in terms of, okay, he was scripted, to whom was he saying what, how did he say it, etc. And then you start to unpack the politics of dramaturgy and of discourse. So now let's apply that a bit to our field, the field of the environment. And it is just sheer impossible that anybody in this room has not seen this picture. And of course the question is that because it was an important event, or is it because it was meant to be shared? And the answer obviously is both is true. And so this was a heavily staged performance because actually, as many of you will know, it was at the beginning of the COP. So it was the French did something to the script rather than having these COPs like in Copenhagen where after 2 weeks they still haven't the result and the heads of state have to leave. They thought, why not get the heads of state in and have an agreement on the first day and then we hammer it out later on and then perhaps water it down a bit. But at least in terms of the scenography, we have that incredible success. And if you look at how that dramaturgy of environmental politics works, it is the very same dramaturgy that we already know since 1972, when we actually used the dramaturgy of international relations to shape the politics, the political dramaturgy of environmental politics. And that's impactful. It is impactful that we talk about the environment in the way in which we also talk about international relations. And in particular in a Cold War context, of course. Now, what the argument is of the book is that we've come accustomed to talk about the environment in a particular way. This was actually already in that 95 book. But I've tested it, and I think we still, by and large, talking in ecological modernization terms. So the point is, Truman, with development post-war, the modernization project, invoking science to improve the state of humanity, and of course further the American project, right, has to undergo now a new phase of ecological modernization. And the point is you keep something stable, your way of life, for instance, by invoking a trajectory of positive sum solutions, right? It is actually better, it's cheaper. If you don't waste energy, actually you save money, right? So that is the logic of ecological modernization in its essence. But it's also confinement of politics. Politics suddenly becomes policy making. And what happened in the 1980s in Europe, but also in the United States, was that social movements were driven out because it was no longer useful. The languages of a social movement was no longer meaningful. You had to wear a suit. You had to become a policymaker. And that is very profound, because if you look at, for instance, 1970s Earth Day in the United States, 22 million Americans went to the street. 22 million in the United States. It's still to this very day the biggest single demonstration. It was not in one place. It was in different, on a topic. And the point was, it was not only about the environment. It was called Earth Day, but it was also anti-war. It was anti-consumerism. It was connecting to the civil rights movement. So people must have thought this is a scary situation. And they funneled politics into policy making, of course, according to sectoral logics, and therefore all these interlinkages were no longer relevant. If you bring it up actually to this very day in Europe, and you say civil rights and environment, this is the wrong room. This is the room of the environment proper. Natural science defines the problems. And so the IPCC, IPBES is a logic in which we voluntarily dedicate our time to talk about what the situation is and what the solutions are. And only very marginally you now see the emergence of social scientists that say, well, actually, we also have an idea about what the problem is, and that's slightly different. To this very day, social scientists, by and large, figure at the end, right? So what can we do? Like, can behavior change be organized? But that's, of course, a very instrumental employment of social science. And issues have to be resolved via the efficiency of the market and technological innovation. And so the famous statement by the older Bush, 1992, he said, okay, we're going to help save the world as the United States of America, but the American way of life is not up for discussion. And finally, the appeasement of the global south via financial compensation. So there was a logic of the price had to be determined from the global north to enable the global south to follow that trajectory. But that trajectory was not open, the trajectory was fixed. Now let me quickly zoom in on the crucial practice of the science policy interface. It's actually a dramaturgy in itself. It's very complex how it functions. But by and large, it's a set of policed institutional routines that define issues for political decision making. It gives scientific experts extraordinary power. They are producing these assessment reports. And the policymakers take them as truth. And they say, okay, we have to act, what can we do? And then the assessment agency says, well, here are a few options. What is your value orientation? Well, there's a whole way in which there's a logic that is operational, like policy prescriptive, not allowed. Policy relevant, recommended. But there's much more going on. And I give you one that gives you the sense of what a discourse and dramaturgical analysis or good STS work could bring. So we did an article. Lisette van Beek is a part of a PhD with Jeroen and Peter Pelzer and Detlef van Vuren, who is one of the big modelers of this whole game, the image model. And what we looked into was how the 1.5 degree special report was made. And of course, the logic of Paris was that we needed to have a possibility to keep the United Nations together. Because there were these small island states, and perhaps you remember these images of the ministers from the small island states having a meeting underwater. They had dramaturgically staged the idea that if the world would not improve on its climate record, they would drown. And for the United Nations, that would be a constitutional crisis, right? Because they would lose member states. And I mean, any organization that loses member states voluntarily is, of course, doomed. So they needed the 1.5 degree target because academics immediately said, well, okay, then we have a 50% chance that these island states will remain in place, more or less. But how did they come to that statement that 1.5 degree was possible? Well, you ask a model. Well, a model is basically what you put in, you get out, right? And of course, if there are policymakers that see it as truth machines, they just look, okay, so the modelers, the academics, the scientists have said it is possible. So, okay, let's just figure out how we then divide the workload. But actually, this model was politically calibrated because it was a given that it had to arrive at a 1.5 degree target. So what happened? We invented negative emissions. We invented negative emissions. And you can keep turning that knob on your dashboard or pushing it up until you arrive at 1.5 degree. But how realistic is it? How realistic is that the West can continue keeping emitting CO2 and then assume that in 10 years' time we have this incredible industrial process going where we put everything under the ground at a financial rate that we think is feasible? It's completely magical thinking. And what I notice, and you should watch the newspapers, more and more people in the core of the policy system invoke this word, magical thinking. So they now are hedging already for it not working and them not being shown to be naive. So Veit Barel from the International Energy Agency, he is a true specialist. He says, well, it is magical thinking. Well, many others, and I'll give you the details in the book. But the point of us here, that models are used to rescue the UN policy and leading to the net zero discourse that we now take at face value, right? Every organization has a net zero strategy. But it all assumes that we can postpone measures because later on there will be the technological innovation. What's the special envoy? Kerry said, you know, the good thing about our idea of innovation is that we can assume that there will be technologies later on that solve it. Well, what's that?
Magical thinking.
Magical thinking. So, and these models, of course, work in the funnel. So the point is that stranded assets were by the modelers themselves assumed to not be acceptable. So they never modeled the influence of stranded assets on actually what's on their pathway. So it works both ways, and that is what we call political calibration of a model. So I hope you don't feel suffocated and that I draw all the hope out of the system. But I think even if you're a constructivist, you have to have a realist, understanding of what's going on. And let's then think about whether or not we can arrive at something. Well, this you might have seen in the social media. Eh? So this is all the COPs plotted on a graph with the CO2 emissions. But this is, of course, in the heart of the policy process. Eh? So we even have now an official report that everybody very easily refers to as the GAP report. It's provided by the United Nations Environmental Programme. Again, the PBL is working at it with a large group of people, and it constantly monitors to what extent we are achieving our goals. Is there a need for me to explain this model? I think you know this. Carbon budget, same story, right? I mean, there are still carbon budget remaining. On the justice dimension, you could say they should be allocated for the global south. Actually, that's not what's happening. That's why we invented the CCS story. And of course, the carbon inequality comes to it. Now, look at the dramaturgy of European politics. I was invited to speak about that. Here we have Hannah Ritchie, and she's a star at the moment. Why is she a star? Because she says, it's all going to be well. And she's a data analyst, and she herself says, I'm in the tradition of Rusling. And Rusling, you remember from the population and so forth, an excellent statistician from Sweden who could very easily make complex problems understandable. And she does something with the environment. And one of the things that features very prominently in that is the solar PV story, which is incredible success also here. But the point of Fate Viral is, if you look at my graphs, it's the EAA, this is not the one that you want to look at because it is in the north. Far too much of the installed capacity of PV is in the global north. If we want to be able to reach the 1.5 degree, it has to be in the low-income countries to avoid that they use their fossil reserves, right? But that is not what's being financialized. That's not what's being organized. So this graph that is really in the center of this book is actually a graph that you shouldn't use to prove the point. And if you then say, well, here's the natural scientist versus the social scientist, well, we just need to put a price on carbon and make sure the risks pay most. Yeah, well, in that case, it would all be easy, right? But for us, of course, then the whole story starts. Okay, how do we put a price on carbon and how do we make sure that the rich pays most? In a politics that's captured, right? I mean, we see that every day. So I don't know if you're familiar with this article by Owens et al. In Nature Sustainability, but they did a magnificent analysis of the critical minerals that are needed. So the European Union now has, after years and years and years, finally a critical mineral strategy, and it's a geopolitical discourse. So they say we have to now collaborate because the Chinese, they are there first, and they own all these mines. So now, as Europe, we're going to have a concerted effort to get our access to critical minerals. But who owns these critical minerals? And then it comes out that lots of the land is actually First Nations and not at all easily accessible without dispossessing people. And so this whole colonial agenda is missed in that EU strategy of critical minerals. And we have to, I suppose, if you really want to look at a just transition, you have to take that into account and think about a post-colonial way of dealing with supply of critical minerals. Now, there's a third reason why I think we have to go to the deep leverage point that Donella once distinguished and said, well, if we're going to make it, we have to go there. And that is that we insist on mopping with the tap running. I don't know if that's an English expression, but in the Netherlands, where we like water metaphors for obvious reasons, mopping with the tap running doesn't make sense, right? You have to turn the tap and then mop. But this is what happens. So this is around the corner from my place. we used to ride in smaller vehicles, and then they became bigger. And then the industry invented SUVs, sport utility vehicles. Actually, I noticed Bangalore also really likes them. And this is an interesting, because this one is electric. So it's an EV SUV. But the car weighs 2,500 kilos. And therefore has to have a very big battery pack with incredible critical mineral loads. Once I saw that, I started to look around, and this is all in my neighborhood. What sort of vehicles people now see as an aspirational good? Because you want to distinguish yourself. So here, and I mean, this one is also very popular, I noticed, in Bangalore. So there is this whole shift towards futile new ways to be mobile that are all privately owned and inherently push up any sort of efficiency gains we make in terms of the battery load. Like yesterday in the conversation, there is indeed a much higher rate of the efficiency of batteries, but if you make your cars heavier, well, it's the classical paradox. So I stop putting more images on, but mopping with the tap running is just not going to work. There is no statistic that would suggest that we can then get to a safe future for humanity. And the point, of course, is that ecological modernization cannot make that choice because it assumes that everything is going to remain the same, but on an ecological footing. So ecological modernization nurtures aspirational futures that do not bend the trend. I don't know if you can see it, but this is actually an EV Hummer. And it was chosen by President Biden, who's driving it, or carefully driving it, and to show what the Inflation Reduction Act is about. Well, point taken, and of course Carbon Brief was the first to do that and immediately put it on the graph and said, well, if we elect Trump, this is about where we're going to end, but look at where we end with Biden. This is the target. I mean, so it is not as if we can, there is incredible sum of money moved around with the Inflation Reduction Act, but we have, as of yet, not a way to make that actually shown to help us out. Now I'm come to the final bit of my talk. Because I think we just cannot stay in that limited space of environmental policy making and governance to resolve and address this. And I say that also because I observe politics changing dramatically in its drama, but also in the localities where it actually takes place. And this is, for me, a point that marks the beginning of something new. The Yellow Vest protest in 2019 in Paris. You know who protested? These were, by and large, poor people protesting against an increase in the tax on petrol that made their life impossible. Because they were locked into lifestyles that depended on a Renault Clio to get to their groceries, shopping, etc. There is no public transport in rural France. So these people were pushed out of their comfort zone. They did not see what their livelihoods could be. And this backlash, cultural backlash, is something that you cannot address with ecological modernization. Because then they say, strange intellectualism, statistics. So to my astonishment, in February 2023, on the high street of Oxford, there was a protest of thousands of people against the 15-minute city. You know, the 15-minute city is a planning concept by Carlos Moreno, who basically very benign says, a city without cars is actually very pleasant to live in. Why don't we try and organize everything you need on a daily basis within 15 minutes? Like Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, is now implementing. But here, it is a dystopian hell. Governments are lying to you. Jail the government for treason. Say no to human slavery. What's going on? There is actually the environment has become part of a discourse post-COVID of the system versus the people. This is complex, and that's where we need new spokespersons to get that squared than the people who are working for the IPCC. So my and Jeroen's prediction is that if we don't step in and quickly change something, this is where we will end. geoengineering. Because geoengineering fits the funnel. People are already working on it. This experiment actually, in a sense, didn't go through because there was a protest against it. But geoengineering is a sort of a technology of last resort. The crisis is now so big, therefore we must experiment. We don't know what the outcome is, and it has military overtones, right? So the people who are most interested in is the State Department in the United States, not the EPA, not for sure not the EPA. And this is so if we want to avoid this with all the political complexities, this is Robert Jung revisited and times 100, Atoomstaat 1971. This is of course, have you just imagined that an American experiment has a problem here in India, right? It's ruining the mousson rain or whatever. I mean, we would be in a different world. Okay, so let me now, after all these big strategies, end with 5 emerging strategies that are tiny, but I hope they give the seeds for an alternative discourse. And let's realize that we cannot start from scratch. We are in sticky territory because people have become accustomed to fossils and they have changed their idea of freedom. Fossil freedoms is the freedom to go on a cheap flight to wherever for a weekend. Fossil freedom is the entitlement for a suburban life, even if it's difficult to organize it on a sustainability base. And people like their entitlement, so they fight back. Well, one strategy that I think is interesting emerging in Europe is to break with the non-seeing. So one discursive phenomenon is that, of course, the IPCC is problematizing by showing, by seeing. But there is a flip side to modernization, that is to avoid that nasty things are being seen. And that can be addressed by social movements. So this is a Ende Gelände in Germany that march through an open day lignite brown coal mine, which is, in terms of CO2 emissions, a disaster, but is crucial for the German energy system. And they march to show what sort of Mad Max situation is behind the electricity that comes from your socket. London, Extinction Rebellion initially was frustrating the Londoners, but had a good slogan. We disrupt traffic, which is easy, because you disrupt the climate. I mean, that is a logic that you have difficulty in counterposing. Look at what they also did, and Liberate Tate, this was already in 2011. You cannot guard our cultural heritage if you are sponsored by firms that threaten it. All museum sponsors by fossil is over. It's no longer possible to be in the moral high ground and be subsidized by fossils. Symphony orchestras opting out of fossil subsidies. This is because of social action. The university, you cannot educate new generations and invest in fossils at the same time. This is 350.org, a very effective environmental organization, sharing knowledge and now having impact also on pension funds. You cannot guarantee the future of our children if the pensions invest in fossils. So this divestment strategy, it circumvents the political core and it still has effects. The second one is what's happening in the courts, litigation. And this is a truly stunning story. Mind you, it relies on IPCC knowledge. Without IPCC reports, no judge would say to the Dutch state, you have to beef up your efforts to reduce CO2 emissions. No judge would say to Shell, you have to lower your emissions faster than you're now doing. And there are now hundreds of cases. And the good thing is there's a litigation network with lots of academics behind it, lots of professional lawyers that exchange the materials, how you do this effectively. And I'm proud to say that Lisette actually was also as a witness bringing information to a coming case in the Netherlands where banks are actually held responsible. The third is easing the capture. It is also, of course, a possibility in a complex world that, not because of the IPCC, but because of the realization that the financial system itself is in danger. So that you don't stop with emitting carbon, or that you stop with subsidizing or insuring carbon firms, because you think it's just a financial risk. Yeah? So the logic of the financial system in itself becoming a site of politics. And I think that is something really powerful, and where we in Europe see that regulators like the European Bank step in big time. So if you, as a bank, do not know exactly in what industrial works you invest, you have a problem. You have to go all the way, scope 1, then 2 and 3, to tell the regulator what's happening. The fact that there is lots of co-option and captured politics, and therefore scope 3 is still not in the regular system. Well, the good thing, and that's the irony of neoliberalism, we put that bank at the distance of politics. Now, one of the good things of having put the European Central Bank at the distance is that it now has decided for itself that climate is important for the system, and is therefore, the capture is much less. Almost there. Evading the capture. There is quite a good track record now of citizen juries. So I was involved in one in the Netherlands, and to our surprise, so a representative group of Dutch citizens were willing to take far more radical measures than the parliament would ever accept. So there is apparently a way of reinventing political practice, or also the practice of democracy, that can help create better climate outcomes. Fifth, unleashing the imagination. I mean, we can also, of course, focus on where it works well, like the new campus that IIHS is now building, right? It would be a utopian practice if you get it to work. People would visit it to visit the future. And we did a book on that, Neighborhoods for the Future, in which we basically looked at the most radical in OECD countries examples of low CO2 neighborhoods, and we actually visited Philip's neighborhood as part of that. And so it brings in actually a register that in the old politics was always pushed aside. If you were utopian, you say, what if we would? People would say, no, that's not realistic. We're not going to talk about a way of life. We're not going to talk about other than market instruments. But I think we see an emergence of these utopian practice, prefigurative politics, that we as academics can contribute to. We can provide a narrative how that would become performative. So my conclusion is, I think it's time for a new dramaturgy, obviously with the new sites, and also for new storytelling. And ecological modernization is not going to deliver. Geoengineering is looming. And I think we have to think of new narratives. And my argument would be to background CO2. So not forget about it, keep measuring it really well, but not try and persuade audiences with CO2. Try to persuade them by that the present is perhaps not perfect, that the American aspirational goods of SUV are perhaps not necessarily leading to happiness. Focus on new aspirational futures, and also dare to engage, and that's what we really like in the Reset Consortium, in epochal narratives. Say, like, if this was the post-war situation, what is our response to the Beveridge report? The Beveridge report that said, well, we need a welfare state. We don't know how we're exactly going to pay for it, but we need it nevertheless. And it worked. So we perhaps can help create such narratives that relate the past in an honest way, also including the colonial record, to the present and to the future. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Maarten. That was really huge canvas that he covered, and some really important things. I mean, I'm going to ask Mark to start, but before that, a few things that were kind of striking. I think, you started with deep leverage points, right? And Donella Meadows, critical paper on that. Actually, if you run through that paper, it's about 10 and then 12 ways to change the world. The most significant and most powerful is actually exactly what you're talking about. It's about creating new mythologies. So it's myth making that actually helps transform people and their cultures, because that's what resets goals, and then the entire, all the elements of system change come from that. So I think what you laid out is very, very interesting. The challenge for us is, of course, let's say in the Indian context, it's not only the question of ecological modernization hybridized with sort of neoliberal enthusiasm, right? But it's also that's operating in a social and economic system that is extremely highly stratified, and in some cases maybe pre-modern. It's a combination of these two that give you a very interesting and challenging environment to to work in. So the question, I guess, is not only in the sort of techno-managerial, tunneling through, but what does it mean in terms of the social imaginary, in the nature of politics, in the nature of culture, which is so one of the, I think, the challenges that we're dealing with as many cultures in the global south, or many cultures within this continent or subcontinent, is what those social imaginaries would actually be like. And I think reworking those and reworking some of the things that we take completely for granted. The nation state as we have it, Westphalian, the firm as we have it, the economy as we have it, are all creations of the last 500 years. So they're absolutely situated in the Holocene, and many of them have sort of pre-modern elements to it, which become the contradiction. So I think the question is, what are those imaginaries of culture, of family, of gender, etc., which are the big debates that we are facing, actually, if they play themselves out. And we are sitting in a global crisis where we have an international system which is not fit for purpose. We have a set of interacting global crises, and there is nobody in charge of the governance, because the international system is dealing with what happens between countries. It can't even control financial markets. It has no way of even imagining that, and it cannot control the global commons, which is what we're talking about in some senses. So there's a huge gap in that space. So even in political theory, how does one sort of construct that? I'll come back later on some of the drama. I was implicated in the drama of the 1.5, and we can talk about that later, and how that did or didn't work itself out. But over to Mark to hear about, the clicker.
Okay, yeah, yes.
So 10 postulates about the future of Africa. Or the world, because Africa is the future of the rest of the world, fine. People don't realize that,
Yeah. Can we go to full
screen?
full screen? I'm a bit self-conscious because Megan is here. She's my critic of PowerPoint presentations. So I'm glad that Maarten ended off with this is the time for storytelling, and in particular new stories. And what I decided to do in this presentation is to talk about Africa. Now, I hate talking about Africa because it creates the impression that Africa is a place. Africa isn't a place. It's a multiplicity of different countries. India is a place made up of lots of different...
Many states of mind.
But nevertheless, I think it's important to do. And I want to draw on some recent work that I've done with my colleague Desta Mebratu. We were the co-lead authors of the Economic Report on Africa. The Economic Report on Africa is the flagship publication, the annual flagship publication of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which is and has traditionally been the most influential and significant macroeconomic policy influencer on the African continent. And they asked two African intellectuals who are associated with sustainability to write the 2024 report. And the title of that report is Financing Sustainability Transitions. And when we were requested to do this, we were rather flabbergasted. And in December, when I was sitting in the headquarters of UNECA in Addis Ababa, thinking back a decade or so earlier when I was invited to various meetings there and no reference was ever made to sustainability, I realized how quickly things can actually change. So I want to draw on this, and I want to go up against Afro-pessimism as the real deep underlying narrative enemy on the African continent. The enemy for those who want to think big along the lines that Maarten is talking about. And this is reflected in the titles of The Economist magazine in particular. So the most offensive one being Africa, the Hopeless Continent. There is a new narrative that's starting to emerge, which is Africa Rising. But even if you look at COVID, Africa's long COVID, deeply pessimistic view of Africa's COVID experience, even though Africa was one of the most successful places in dealing with it with the lowest level of resources. So I want to go up against this, and I want to do it drawing on the work that I've been doing with Desta, and I want to put down 10 propositions that helps reframe the African story and end off with 5 challenges. And you can join the dots along the way, because I'm not going to flesh it out in an academic narrative. I'm just going to, in a sense, articulate what I think are the 10 propositions that reframe how we think about the future. One of them is fairly obvious, that Africa is uniquely endowed, in particular with natural resources, but that endowment reinforces other endowments, the youth dividend, the labor force explosion, and the digital revolution that is underway. If you just look at the distribution of these natural resources across the African continent, it's widely and fairly evenly spread, and it's worth billions. Africa has 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 20% of the world's oil, and 8% of the world's natural gas resources, and yet it's the poorest continent. So we need to kind of climb into that and say, okay, how do we rethink the use of natural resources on the African continent? Proposition 2, Africa will have the largest labor force by 2060 as other regions get older and that labor force declines. The bad news for Asia is it's going to no longer be the largest labor force. It will drop to 40%, and Africa will significantly rise. And that has major implications if you think of human potential as something to be harnessed for economic transformation. Africa will have the largest share of young people in the second half of the 21st century, as reflected in this diagram. And yet, of course, poverty challenges, like here in India, remain. 30 to 35% are classified as poor, 450 million people, and 100 million are extremely poor. And that's not going to change anytime soon, but it's how you think about poverty and the appropriate economic responses. Proposition 3, which is where all of us interact with Edgar Peterson as well. Africa's urban population of 600 million is the wealth generator of the future. It's bigger than Europe's 350 or so million, and it's going to double in size in the next 30 years. It doubled in size between 2020. It's going to double in size again by 2050. Again, do we just get depressed by this, or do we think about, well, what kind of reconfigurations of space is going to allow us to start thinking about industrial policy in a different way? 60% of that population is at the bottom of that pyramid, if you like, below the poverty line. However, the middle class is growing, like in India. The sub-Saharan African middle class is often written off, but if you combine that with the Middle East and North Africa middle class, it's not that much bigger, that much smaller than Central and South America, which is on the map. So why isn't, so those are the kinds of things that we need to start thinking about. Proposition 4 is that African governance is more open and more democratic than ever before, despite what's been happening in the last year. This is the Rwanda genocide memorial, which really kind of marks a decisive turning point in the way in which Africans have thought about governance over the last 20 years. This is a map of political regimes between 1985 and 2015. Red is bad, the dictatorships and authoritarianism, and the non-red is better, and some of it's quite good. So that just is a kind of quick image that asks you to say, we need to recognize that democratization with reversals is significant on the African continent. And the drivers are twofold. Top down, the African peer review mechanism, where there's an African political elite, if you like, that kind of defends democracy. But what is often ignored is Africa Uprising, or what I prefer, which is Africa Uprising, which is not what the front cover of Time magazine talks about. And it is the third wave of African uprisings in 45 different countries, most of which has not reported at all. The first wave was the 1950s that got rid of colonialism. The second was the uprisings of the 90s that got rid of the dictatorships, with Ethiopia and South Africa being the key shifts of the early 90s. And now we have another uprising, largely urban youth. And what is it going to leave behind? It left behind formal colonialism. It left behind the dictatorships. What's it going to leave behind? Or is it going to deepen into the kinds of civil wars we see destroying Sudan and northern Ethiopia? Proposition 5, Africa has become, and you guys will probably dispute this, has become the startup continent, driven by a young, vibrant, entrepreneurial set of networks. Sometimes they're referred to Africa's urban hackers. These are under-resourced IT wizards collecting themselves in many of Africa's urban centers and hacking their way through into completely new ICT environments. And that correlates with an extraordinary mushrooming of startups across the African continent. And these are where Africa's startup activities are concentrated, again, very youthful, IT-linked, hacker-linked, mushrooming inside of these messy urban environmental urban systems that Africa is well known for, where survival means learning, unlearning, and relearning in a blink of an eye, and shifting your identities depending on who wants to buy. Lagos is by far the startup capital of the continent. Proposition 6 is that there's rising levels of investment by non-African and African investment, and increasingly, significantly longer term, maybe I shouldn't say long term, but longer term visions behind many of those investments. And this is an interesting figure. I mean, Africa's FDI relative to GDP is higher than most of other regions. And that's not often taken into account. These are the fastest growing African countries, concentrated up in the northeast. And as you can see, my country, South Africa, doesn't feature there, although it's the most industrialized economy. Because we face an energy crisis, 4 or 5 hours of blackouts every day, we cannot compete with these growth levels. The number of private equity investors in Africa, based in Africa, is growing substantially. And that unlocks what has never been available on the African continent before, which is risk capital. The real GDP growth between 2019 and 23 has also been fairly impressive. It's just below what Asia has been, and it's higher than some of the other regions in the world. All of that, all of the economics that I've spoken about now, obviously has implications for social and health. And given my limited time, Proposition 7 is really focused on the girl child as a key indicator of a shift in the social composition of society at the base. As you can see, the girl child is at primary school level is now higher. The percentage of educated girl child is higher than boys, and catching up with respect to the other education levels. Coming back to The Economist's magazine front cover on Africa's long COVID woes, you can see on the right-hand side that Africa did pretty well in dealing with COVID. But that's not acknowledged because of Afro-pessimism, which is not just about what happens outside of Africa. Afro-pessimism can actually infect elites and movements in negative ways on the continent. Proposition 8 is Africa's installed generation capacity at the moment is roughly equal to what exists in France. In gigawatt hours, it's equal to France and Germany combined, with a population of what, 140 billion? Africa with over 1 billion. If Africa energizes using fossil fuels, none of our targets agreed, doesn't matter where, Paris, Cancun, Dubai, whatever, will be achieved, finished. And that's an absolute, indisputable fact, okay? But do we think about what it takes to make sure that Africa does leapfrog over the fossil fuel infrastructures? If it doesn't, we really are globally all in trouble. And therefore, the world does have an interest in supporting the African transition. Climate change is going to affect Africa most severely, and that's reflected in this diagram. The darker the color, the more severely impacted it's going to be. And when you come to Africa's renewable energy resources, this is pretty impressive. I mean, here are the solar resources, here are the geothermal resources, and these are the wind resources. Africa, in many ways, has the best solar resources in the world. It also has some of the best biodiversity stroke adaptation resources in the world, and has some of the largest supplies of critical minerals. All of this is needed for the energy transition. Is this another recipe for another scramble for African resources that gets extracted by everybody else for their benefits? Or are African leaders going to strategically register this and say, we are now in an advantageous position. We lack capital, yes, but can we renegotiate the terms of our relationship with the rest of the global economy? The target set by the African Renewable Energy Initiative, announced on the wings of the Paris Summit, was 300 gigawatts. If you look at the diagrams on the right, 45 gigawatts in the 10-year period leading up to, 2025. And the top three countries are South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. But Egypt is growing much faster than South Africa. So you can see South Africa gets smaller to the right as you get to 2025. But that, I think, is going to change quite quickly. And Morocco is also speeding along with. So those are the three kind of top three countries in terms of the Renewable Energy Initiative. Proposition 10 is the infrastructure agenda. There's a proliferation of projects across the continent. In my former role as chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we lend money across Africa. We did an assessment of the constraints on funding projects. The conclusion was surprising. There's obviously plenty of demand, plenty of need for infrastructure projects. Surprisingly, there's more than enough money. The constraint is project preparation capabilities to translate potential bankable projects into actual projects. That's the real constraint, and obviously education, the improvement of universities, the urbanization of skills, and so on, is going to contribute positively in that direction. And that's reflected in the fact that now African governments are the #1 funders of infrastructure on the African continent, no longer external funders. Yes, China has become the next big player and is #2 to South African government. To African governments. You can see there's a very thin line for India, which is getting a little fatter. But the lines for many of the traditional funders are remaining static or shrinking. Investments in infrastructure, as I've already indicated, are dramatically on the rise. And I think one can argue that Africa can attract the estimated 175 billion per annum that is needed to eradicate poverty. But that will require fundamental changes to the global financial system. And that relates to something I'll briefly mention, which is the Nairobi Declaration. So there on the blue are the current trends. The darker blue are the Africa 2063 goals, and the yellow takes you up to the SDG goals applied to the African continent. But the 175, the gap is $175 billion per annum if you want to address Africa's infrastructure backlog. The greening of infrastructure thinking is also happening across the continent. This is just one example of an eco-city in Casablanca, Morocco, where quite ambitious ideas of connecting urbanism, greening, renewable energy are coming together. And these are there are other examples. I didn't want to use a South African example because that's too predictable. So the final proposition is really about governance. There is greater and greater capacity for Pan-African planning and coordination across what could very well become the largest free trade, and with potential, it is already the largest free trade area in potential terms, but it has to be operationalized, and that's being put together. I like this picture because there's moves towards a Pan-African passport, and there's a couple of leaders holding it up. But this is the picture of the founding meeting of all the heads of state that signed off on the African continental free trade area, creating one African market. And South Africa is playing a very quiet, because we have to tread lightly on the African continent, but very significant role in putting together the institutional rules of the game for this extraordinary free trade area to get off the ground. So I want to end off by talking about 5 challenges. The most significant one from a resource point of view is turning the critical minerals curse into a blessing. And on the top there, you will see all the key critical minerals that you can find in Africa, and you can basically find them nearly all. But if you then look at the bottom, which is where they are processed, China dominates. So what these 2 diagrams show is that Africa has these minerals, but they basically largely exported in raw form, and much of it to China. And that has to turn around. China has, unfortunately, a policy of buying up rare earths all around the world and not using their own until they've used up everybody else's. And we have to go up against that by recognizing this as an opportunity rather than a problem. The second challenge is greening through biodiversity and not just focusing on energy. And this is just a map of all the mangroves, forests, natural resource, biodiversity resources across the African continent prepared by IPBES. And the African Development Bank is taking forward this agenda in a very significant way under the leadership of its new chief economist, Kevin Urama, someone we all know. Challenge 3 is the Nairobi Declaration. I can't emphasize enough the significance of the Nairobi Declaration issued at the end of the first Africa Climate Summit in 2023. This was the brainchild and pet project of the president of Kenya, Ruto, who's quite an extraordinary leader. And the most significant part besides stating very clearly that coal phase out is part of the African agenda in global negotiations, the most significant part of the Nairobi Declaration is a very, very detailed breakdown of the kinds of quite radical reforms that are required at the global level of the global financial system. So, in other words, reinforcing the Bridgetown Initiative from the Prime Minister of Barbados and the very clearly articulated agenda of the Secretary General of the UN calling for reforms to the global financial system. The African leaders actually took it further. But this is happening on a continent which has traditionally been quite donor dependent. And so how do you rethink finance on the African continent when you actually can't just print money, QE, which you've done in Europe and in the US and other places? You can't just borrow more, tax more, and spend more, neo-Keynesianism. You have to find a completely new way of thinking about the raising of the kinds of capital, especially that's available on the continent and elsewhere, to spend on what we need to do. And that brings into, in my mind, the need for what some colleagues and I are calling the monetary architecture approach. I'm a member of the National Planning Commission, appointed by the President to develop long-term plans for South Africa, and I head up the finance task team. And in that task team, we've brought together a group of specialists to start mapping the architecture of the financial ecosystem. And the aim, which has never been done and has hardly been done in many other global south countries, the main aim is to identify the interlocking balance sheets that could be mobilized to raise the capital that is sitting in, for example, the pension industry. You don't have such a big pension industry. We have a gigantic one. The amount of money in our pension industry is equal to 50% of our GDP. Imagine what that would be in your country. And 45% of that, 45% of that money leaves the country. Less than 10% actually goes into the real economy, and less than that goes into infrastructure. And unless you find a reconfiguration of balance sheets that allows you to unlock that kind of capital, and I can give you many other examples, you are going to end up at a dead end. And the dead end is, let's just print money. You can't do that in this kind of economy. Let's borrow, tax, and spend more. Keynesianism, and it's not going to happen. And so you have to mobilize capital in a very, very, very different way. And this is the work that we're doing. And then as far as poverty is concerned, yes, poverty, inequality, inclusion are challenges, but it's insufficiently linked to the potential of industrial policy. Fortunately, industrial policy is back on the agenda in the African continent. Second generation industrial policy, which is not about picking winners, but about inclusive decision making along value chains. But none of that's really possible if we don't reconfigure our urban systems, because the two go together in fundamental ways. Sorry. I did it again. Let me just get to the last slide, which is really about the work that we've done for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to develop an alternative way of understanding the just transition. So this is the diagram at the very center of the economic report for Africa that's going to be released in April. Is going to be presented at a summit of ministers of finance and economics, and it's going to put the just sustainability transition, JST, firmly on the African agenda at the highest possible level. And so this is really just a diagram to kind of capture what that fairly lengthy report is all about, connecting all the stuff that we're fairly familiar with, but we talk about socially just, we talk about transition economies, and what's this last one here? The ecologically sustainable. We don't talk about zero carbon. We talk about a low carbon transition, because in the African context, we actually have to increase some of our energy infrastructures that is going to raise carbon emissions in certain ways, but not by any means to the extent that would happen if we followed a traditional high carbon transition route to development. So this really brings to an end what I want to try and achieve, which is simply to say we have to tell a new story about the dynamics of change on the African continent. And we have to start presenting a story that appreciates the potential, addresses the challenges, and mobilizes the already mobilized civil societies and political elites to start realizing that the solutions lie on the continent, and we have to get together in ways that we haven't really got together before. And I think that's roles, certain dynamics, configurations, coalitions within and outside the formal governance institutions, I find quite hopeful, despite the fact that we have deepening civil wars in Sudan, northern Ethiopia, coups in West Africa, and kind of financial meltdowns through debt, over indebtedness in the central and southern parts of Africa. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was another tour de force in many ways. It's interesting, this last diagram that's there, it maps very strongly, and I guess it's because many of us have been talking about this kind of stuff fairly well, with the dramaturgy that we set up, Maarten, in the 1.5 report. So, I had the unfortunate challenge with Helen to, in a sense, build the narrative of how the solutions can be found. 1.5 report actually was, in some senses, a political cop-out as far as the climate, science community was concerned, because Paris basically said everything below 2, and then a whole range of countries, including India and many others, were saying 2 is just not acceptable, we have to get to 1.5. And then, in a sense, the UNFCCC and the global community basically outsourced the finding of the solutions to the science community, which is kind of the other way around of the science policy interface. Usually the science folks get the evidence and then you act on the policy. This was, hey guys, we've got to get somewhere. Is there any evidence? And when we started, some of us said, look, this is an insane task. We do not have evidence in 2016, enough evidence to put together an assessment by 2018 to actually show that this thing is actually possible. Now, the remarkable thing that did happen, whether it was sort of modernist or ecological modernism, etc., was the global scientific community across the world, including PBL, who were part of that process, mobilized. And in 1.5 years, we did have a lot of evidence. And I think part of the evidence in the storytelling was, and part of it is, I would say, a little confounded, was we said, look, in 2018, it can be done, but you cannot use the current framework, read my lips, of neoliberal economics. Because neoliberal economics talks about trade-offs. And we're saying, look, if we had started doing this stuff in 92, then you could have traded off environment with development, this part of the world, etc. But at the moment, it's impossible to do that. So we have to do 5 things. Those 5 system transitions are necessary to be done simultaneously. The energy one that we were talking about, the ecological one that is absolutely central. And I think Africa is going to be probably much better off in dealing with that than Asia, because Asia has taken down much of its biodiversity resources. The urban and the infrastructure transition, which are absolutely central in what we work on. On top of that, the industrial transition we don't talk about very much, but is very, very important. I mean, from the IRP point of view, you are the gurus in that process. If you don't fix the industrial ecology, then we're done for, whether it's Africa or Asia doing the stuff. That the material flows need to be fixed, especially for the high intensity, high material stuff. And in a sense, the strategic mineral stuff is just the marginal end of the curve. It's actually sitting with steel, cement, glass, and the vision of modernization. So you've got to fix that too. And finally, what came out of COVID was you need to effectively, do stuff on the social end. So the societal transition came out of the COVID experience, saying that people can actually change, regimes can change, and like you've shown with Africa, without any vaccines. I mean, that's a remarkable story. Without vaccines, India could have actually potentially helped if the trade regime was open to make that happen, but it didn't happen. Your outcomes on that were, so basically, dramatic social change can happen at relatively short time points if the conditions are right. So in some senses, this is effectively the same thing. 5 big transitions, the core enablers that we've laid out. But I guess to come back to, and before I open it up for questions, in some senses, part of your narrative is about things that we have been traditionally part of the narrative. That is, we have to end poverty. We have the resources to make it happen across the world, potentially now in Africa. That's part of the news story in some senses. We have to focus on education and health. And in some senses, the really nice thing about that diagram that you showed was African countries are mobilizing to make that happen. And you don't have to depend on the DAC framework. You don't have to potentially depend on the Chinese to make that happen. That's kind of standard territory. But I think the new things we're talking about here in the new narrative is urbanization as the opportunity. That's the big shift that we saw in the negotiations between 2013 and 15, when we repositioned the urban, not as a place where lots of poor people die in slums and have terrible things, to actually creating the opportunity for. So that's one thing that's there. Second thing, infrastructure. People do not associate high-tech, high-productivity infrastructures and associated investments with Africa. So that's, I think, a big shift as far as I'm concerned. But I think, zeroing down on 2 things. The first thing is, the challenge sits in governance, both within the continent, inside the countries, especially in urban regions, and globally, but most critically with the global financial architecture, which is designed as an extension of both colonial and neoliberal practices to make sure the playing field will always be tilted and Piketty's projections will always come through. Because the cost of capital is what it is, the resources are not flowing in the right directions, and you have money bleeding out from your pension funds, from other things as far as that's concerned. So I guess one of the core questions for us in dealing with this stuff is, it's not only the imagination of a new way of doing things, but the architecture that's required to make that happen. And I guess the question is the imagination enough? Or do you need the uprisings to make that happen? And what will those uprisings mean in fortress world, which is in a sense what we have? Because you're in the middle now of a new Cold War. And in a sense, in a Cold War of this scale and size, which is not fully joined as yet, because East Asia is not completely there. It's kind of still holding its balance. If that actually happens, then where will the margins, in some senses, the current peripheries of the world system, but the future centers of the world system actually play itself out? I mean, I think those are the kind of questions that we have to talk about when we're talking about transitions, fine? Because the transitions are in a context, and the context has shifted. Some new stories can emerge, but we have to shift the imagination of how that will work itself out because of it. So anyway, I thought I'd just lay that out because that was really from both ends really provocative. We have to change the mythology because people have to get it. Eventually, it has to be fairly simple. The politics and the aspirations have to shift, to an Anthropocene frame. So I'll sort of stop there and then open up the, for questions, conversations. We've had a very rich and long day, but I'm sure you folks will have some reflections and some provocations for us here. And there may be a few people online too, so maybe we'll get them also to come. So open house, folks. You can address it to both the speakers or one of them. It's up to you. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. I have a question for Professor Maarten. In your presentation, you spoke about incidents where people owned their agency and fought for change. For example, the protests, the climate litigation, and citizen juries. But in my fieldwork in Pavgada Solar Park, I saw that people have self-limiting beliefs in terms of their agency. For example, the marginalized caste groups genuinely believe that they cannot go against the social norms. They believe that they are crippled in a way, living in those villages. Similarly, women believe they cannot fight for their rights, and hence they do not raise their voice against injustices faced by them. So in such communitarian societies, how do you think just transition can be enabled? It will still be top-down and intellectualized.
Can any other question that's related? Somebody wants to come in on that? Yeah, but Maarten, all yours.
Well, I mean, of course, this is also politics, right? I mean, and the idea that people believe that, it doesn't make sense to go to a court or so. I mean, there's a big interest in keeping that like that. Huh? So Friedrich, the old political scientist, said the biggest form of power is the anticipated reaction on behalf of the people who are not in power, right? The disenfranchised. If they think, well, the system is rigged, it doesn't make sense. If you twist the argument, of course, or put it upside down, you say success is infectious. So the fact that now so many litigation cases are brought to court. I mean, we all know the famous one in New Zealand with the river getting rights, right? I mean, Amitav Ghosh said, that's preposterous. I mean, if you would have asked me even, Amitav Ghosh saying, 10 years ago, I would not have believed that it was possible, but it was possible. So people push it. I mean, Latin America, Buen Vivir, an idea, an ecological understanding, getting into the constitution of Ecuador. So that idea that you can support that, because that is a lesson, of course, we can learn from the right. They have a very well organized set of think tanks that feed into each other. Of course, own more or less the media landscape. I mean, we're not going to go there, but definitely you can organize better, that you don't have to invent everything from scratch. There are probably similar cases elsewhere in the world where also, a disenfranchised group thinks, it doesn't make any sense, but have one, and NGOs can form a network, and that is a little sign of hope.
Talk, please.
I just want to respond to your point in a very somewhat crude and blunt way. I spent many years working with social movements in South Africa and out, and I came to a fundamental conclusion, which is poor people, very poor people, don't learn from educated people. And secondly, so they learn from each other. That's the first conclusion. The second is they learn from history. They learn from stories about people like them who did protest. Those are the only things that change the fuses.
In some senses, that is part of the fully Ambedkarite tradition, right? And that's where patriarchy gets undone also. Any other? Yes, please.
So I would kind of add to this question and place it in a more. I think I'm placing it methodologically, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. But so see, but who is the playwright here? There is this dramaturgy, but there is someone who is a playwright. So to the extent that the methodologically it is helping us to uncover the politics is fine. But is it completely, is the politics completely detached from the structure? There is no playwright there. So that is my question. So that the question of agency, who can say, is missing somewhere. So who is saying the method, that it is starting from there, who is saying to whom and where, but who can is also a question. So there is a playwright who is deciding that who can say. Whatever is someone saying is there which is being covered, right? So that is first question. Second question is on the interpretive turn in the public policy. So somewhere I think, I mean, I can be provocative, right? I mean,
Sure,
so, yeah.
absolutely.
So in what I am, so I am also, I would call myself an interpretive, qualitative researcher, but from the last mile side, where I'm listening to people, interpreting, and then kind of trying to say something. But in the name of interpretive public policy, I see that broadly it is getting in a way hijacked by the discourse analysis and framing, those who use those methodologies, happening at my center as well. But I mean, in a kind of setup, say, I mean, all these things would happen when you take action, right? Not kind of keep uncovering the politics around it. And as and when we are getting into deeper and deeper into the micro narratives, I don't see any kind of action agenda emerging out of it. All that we are discussing is, in a way, uncovering the politics, then another layer of politics, and then another layer of politics, and then another layer of politics, and then we... So in a way, it is a kind of a different kind of methodological individualism which is happening here, that you are atomizing narratives to the extent that there's only one individual, and then there's no collective story emerging out of it to take action. So this public policy, I don't think, I mean, that is, let me articulate it as my own normative standpoint, that how can public policy be devoid of action? It has to have a normative commitment to action and structures and institutions. So this is my second point.
So perhaps ask them, answer them in reverse. So I've observed politicians, and so politicians like, of course, to act as if they're leaders, right? I have thought of this idea and I'm proposing it, and it's a great success. But I think it's more valid to say that good politicians are followers, right? They sense things, and then they're the first to walk in front of a movement, saying, "Well, this is my movement," right? Well, if that is true, if there is a dynamic, constantly monitoring, like a banker is monitoring risk, or an insurance firm is constantly monitoring risk. A politician is always monitoring different winds. And I mean, sure, they will also try to suppress, etc. But if something is moving, they want to be part of that movement. Eh? And that is an opportunity. So my post-structuralism is one that recaptures the possibility of agency. So that is, I mean, it took me a while, but I said, Foucault is wrong, the individual is missing, and still we don't have to do away with his whole theory, it's fantastic, but you have to put the agency back into that equation. And was it a coincidence that I wrote that when the Berlin Wall was falling? No, of course it wasn't. Because I thought, how can be the world that I grew up in, of two worlds, the communist and the capitalist world, can tumble down? How can that wall tumble down? I mean, why didn't they shoot? Well, discourse, right? People no longer believe the story. The whole infrastructure was actually a discursive one. So the agency was back into play. But how that then actually works is a very complex one. So I would go for a much more open complexity logic in your political analysis. And you have to do that by doing solid interviewing. So when people, when you ask them, what did you do when you decided that, they come up with the story they think you want to hear. You have to make it much more difficult for them to give the answer. Yeah? To see, but didn't you consider this? And they always say yes, because they also look into that complexity. And then, of course, it opens up, right? Because everything is unstable, but they pretend everything is stable. It is not. Everything is fragile. Judith Butler, change comes from a different form of enactment. Okay, who can? I mean, so I think, so in the Netherlands was a migrant leader who took something to court, discrimination cases. Said, I took it to court, but I'm sure, I mean, I'm a migrant. I'm not going to get it my way, right? And then he got it, and that changed him. And he kept arguing this system of rule of law is fantastic. We have to take it much more seriously. So, I mean, in that again, nothing is fixed. There are people who want you to believe that the system is rigged. And of course, I'm not suggesting, underplaying the degree to which it is being rigged and that is maintained. What was the other question again?
Script writer.
Yeah, but there the analogy goes wrong, right? Because, I mean, so the real reality is one that you go into a situation with a script, but other people, I say, I think I know your script. It's like chess, right? So they write a counter script. So it's not like watching a play in a theater.
Actually, one of the interesting things, and maybe Mark would reflect on this just now, is with the democratization of social media, the idea that you can capture a script and make that agitprop or propaganda itself is something that we need to examine and test. And you can see that playing, I think there's a whole set of social science questions there, especially in our context and even in yours, which is shifting so dramatically that we actually don't, our theory is not able to keep up with the practices as far as that's concerned. The narratives, the counter-narratives, and the construction of agency in practice, in some senses.
Yeah, I mean, a small example is we took the Israeli government to the Constitutional Court.
Yeah.
What's it? ICJ.
ICJ.
The script in South Africa was we'd never win.
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
Yeah. The purpose was actually to take it there, say, see, the powers that be won't agree with us, in order to mobilize the Global South. Yeah? The only person that voted against us was an African judge. And now suddenly that becomes a narrative. Yes, we wrote that script. But it's got a life of its own. Across social media, everybody's just reinterpreting it all in their own way for all the marchers and so on. So.
Can you read out the questions, because it's behind me, so at least a couple of them. Yeah.
So the first question is, since 1972, and considering transitions take 5 decades if they happen, what are the key wins, successes thus far, being from policy and or environmental or social or economic or governance? The second question is, in view of 5 transitions mentioned, what ways can facilitate higher impact in dealing with those over next?
Yeah, I mean, I think what this refers to is what you call the contractive, these contractive cycles. These are long-term,
long
wave development cycles that take 40 to 60 years, and they work themselves out around clusters of technologies around which investments concentrate, and there are kind of transitions from one set of one cluster of technologies over time to others. There is a view that amongst Carlota Perez, held by Carlota Perez, who developed this way of thinking, that what we're experiencing now in the world is the greening of the ICT revolution, industrial revolution. In other words, we had the ICT industrial revolution, we had a midpoint crisis, 2007, 2009. The planet, yes, is falling to pieces on the edge, and so part of consolidating the ICT epoch is the technologies of greening. Versus an alternative view, which is, no, there is plenty of evidence that finance has burnt its fingers and is now moving away from big formal stately, big investment, patient capital has moved into the IT sector, and the kind of cowboys, the reckless financial speculators have moved into green tech. And there's a new contractive cycle, new long wave emerging as finance moves into three major new sectors. Renewable energy is decentralized, new modes of transport, and Web 3.0, the Internet of Things and AI. So as finance moves into those three sectors, a new long wave cycle is in the making. So that's the rationale. I subscribe to that second view, but what will be different to all the previous cycles is that the climate crisis is going to be absolutely decisive in shifting major capital, not just speculative capital, investment capital, into those new technologies. And only then will we really see a significant shift in capital. But how that happens, that's the discussion we've been having about restructuring the global financial system, because the rules of the game prohibit massive flows into those sectors.
I mean, just to add to that, I think it's a mixture of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that's absolutely coupled with that in the food system and other systems. And that's the reason why Africa is so important. So in fact, to pick up on what Maarten said earlier, it's not only the question of geoengineering. It's actually there's a triple sort of triumvirate there: geoengineering, biotech, which we might have seen in COVID, and the AI, IoT stuff coming together. And we have no systems to govern them or even understand how they'll play themselves out. But I mean, just to pick up on the academic discussion from the morning, there's an entire tradition here of Kondratiev which sits within the industrial or 20th century industrial paradigm, which is tied to socio-technical transitions. We have a tremendous amount of understanding of that. There's a new literature which has emerged over the last 15 or 20 years from a different space around socio-ecological transitions. Yeah. One of the most difficult challenges that we face analytically inside the IPCC is to try and bring those two things together. So in fact, what we did in chapter 4, we tried to do in chapter 4, not incomplete task, was to try and bring mitigation and adaptation together with localization, which is really bringing these two strands of engagement. Because socio-ecological brings in both social hierarchy, caste, gender, etc., with ecological processes and the two. And we don't actually have adequate theory in that. And that theory can only, at least in my experience, be built from the ground up. It has to be grounded theory because the innovation has happened in East and Southern Asia, in Africa, as we speak. We have no precedence of that because it's all happening at 1.1, 1.2, 1.5, maybe at 2 degrees, completely outside our historical imaginations of the Holocene, whether the agricultural system or the industrial, which has happened beyond that. So, I mean, this is a really fruitful area for discussion and engagement. Hopefully we can pick it up. Can we pick up the shorter question at the end? Otherwise, we're running desperately over time. Yeah.
While Africa is certainly improving on governance systems, recognizing the global sentiment of national security and a trend away from liberal democracy, which has direct implications on energy security, how does this impact people's ability to imagine shared ownership and justice?
So the one at the bottom?
The last one is Africa, Global South, has been a victim of policed institutional routines. Nairobi Declaration being a counter to one such institutional routine. The discussion on loss and damage fund being another. What new storytelling does the industrialized West or global North need to adopt these?
Well, if you look, I mean, this answer is very complex, but to simplify, if you look at the emergence of the global dialogue around the restructuring of the global financial system, it's an easier conversation, at least to have, than the conversation about let's transform the global economy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because you're talking about a specific set of institutions which have apex institutions, in other words, central banks. Yeah. And then you have the Bank for International Settlement at global level, and you have IMF, the Fed and the IMF. So you have a distinctive set of institutions with players that are quite well networked. So all the reserve banks have a club where they come together and so on and so on. So the conversation, it's not as difficult as having a conversation about restructuring the global economy. and I think it has evolved for me watching it and also kind of participating in surprising ways. So when the Bridgetown Initiative was announced by the Prime Minister of Barbados, you would have thought, what kind of initiative by the Prime Minister of Barbados ever have an impact? But it did. It had a massive impact because it had a kind of incrementalist dimension to it. There were actually practically implementable reforms that the financial system players couldn't simply reject. That became the basis for other initiatives that built on that platform, and the Nairobi Declaration takes it quite far. And then you need to ask yourself, to what extent are there players in the global financial system that are going to start saying, we're going to disinvest from fossil fuels? Well, it started to happen. Even some are saying, we're going to disinvest from coal is the easy one. Gas is slightly harder. Oil is slightly harder, and gas is the hardest because of this nonsense narrative that it's a transition fuel. So those are examples of actual disinvestment decisions taking place. You also have the Bank for International Settlements publishing something called the Green Swan, a report, which says central banks should have traditionally for the last century managed the stability of the currency. They now need a second mandate, which is climate resilience. Now, when I read that, I had to kind of reread this thing over and again. I had to kind of contact people and say, where did this come from? But it's there. Read the Green Swan report. From the heartland, from the Mecca of central banks. And then I think another thing to point out is capitalism is transforming itself. So since 2007, the asset managers have effectively taken over. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, various and through algorithms, there's this massive, rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of asset managers. That is only now being recognized. The massive accumulation of assets because of QE in the central banks. The tripling of the size of the balance sheets of the developer, 523 balance sheets of DFI balance sheets around the world. So there's a kind of organic internal restructuring of financial flows already taking place. If you put that together with Bridgetown, with the UN Secretary General, with the conversations taking place at Davos and various others, the billionaires who want to be taxed more, this adds up. This adds up. I don't think there are enough people joining the dots to tell the story. And I think that's a big problem. But I think there are shifts taking. Individual financial institutions at global and at national level and at very local levels are making decisions that affect financial flows because they are hooked into insurance industries and so on. I just think we need to make a bit more sense of what is actually happening here. And I don't find much lying around that tells the story.
Sure, I mean, part of this is driven by the regional demographic shifts, fine. So there's going to be a lag between where capital is created because there was a massive growth in a particular economy in, let's say, the North Atlantic, now shifting to East Asia, then shifting to South Asia, then shifting to Africa, which will be lag. And that itself, because the pension funds, given that they have 30, 40, 50-year asset holding capacities are going to change the geography of the capital. That's the reason why there's so much pressure on the Bretton Woods system just now to change its fundamental pattern of ownership and decision making, because the capital is now speaking. And BRI, in some senses, has shifted the imagination of what is possible in terms of infrastructure. It completely shifted that dramatically. So you're seeing that happening. So as that moves, the capital will also potentially shift a little bit in the right direction. Then if you get marginal elements to that flow and you're not trapped into debt, which is where the new game is starting, then you have a chance of doing what you're talking about in as far as Africa.
Just one sentence.
Yeah.
There is one text that is very depressing, which is Varoufakis's latest book, which is called Techno-Feudalism. And the subtitle is What Killed Capitalism? So basically, capitalism is over. We're in a new era, and it's the big tech companies that we all work for free, when every time we click. So what's the politics of that is like, I don't know, I can't even think about it.
Okay. So is there any, I can't see it, so any other, one more question? Yeah? Last question.
Last question,
Yeah.
So with the next 100 years of urbanization and billions moving out of poverty and up the social mobility ladder, how do we, A, change expectations and aspirations for consumptive middle-class lifestyles that will blow the planet's resources, and B, not blow up our polity by having to brutally hold the line on a different urbanism or way of urban living? Provocatively, won't infrastructure transitions and eco-cities only take us so far?
It requires a very skilled narration that exposes the absurdity of the present. So that what seems to be an aspirational dream to mimic the lifestyles that were invented in post-war United States and were promoted by techniques of futuring and were facilitated by the invention of the mortgage that allowed people to buy a house in the suburb.
And Hollywood.
And Hollywood. So there's a whole, I mean, we understand quite well how the American dream came about and how the great acceleration was caused. But still, it is very much with us. But on the other hand, I mean, it's so obviously not serving everybody very well, right? So surely, I'm not going to belittle the yellow vests. They feel that they are threatened in their livelihoods for their dependents. But on the other hand, the fact that so many people, and also in Africa, I mean, how much of their income do they have to spend on mobility? How much time do people spend to get to work and to pick up kids, to organize their lives? I mean, to the extent that we can organize an urban life in a different way, it can be persuasive. It can be persuasive to move beyond the way in which we've organized life. And there again, I mean, you have to then not be too strict, right? You can't be, you know, in pro-environment and against the internet. You must say, okay, how can I use the internet to achieve social and environmental goals? I mean, and that imagination, that can also be done by looking where it works, right? That's the prefigurative politics that many environmental scholars now investigate. If this works there, what would it require for to expand? Can we understand, as you know, good public admin or public policy scholars, the conditionalities under which that emerged? What are the contracts? What is the financial structure? Who has the ownership? So, for instance, in the Netherlands, why is there no role for cooperatives in building new housings? Where people are desperate for intergenerational solutions and so forth. Well, I mean, that is because the imagination is not there. And project developers say, well, we find it okay if we keep building the homes, right? At a very high cost and with a good return. So in that sense, the idea of what we often try and do is project yourself in 2050, 2060. And imagine it has worked. We are in more or less a sustainable situation. And now try to narrate how we got there and also explain the absurdity of 2024. Students have no difficulty.
That's a wonderful way to end the evening. Thank you. It's been a great conversation, and thank you folks for lasting through a rather long day. And for those of you online, thanks for joining us.